Hello, my name is Lauren Ewing, and I'm an HR strategic advisor, executive coach, and diversity, equity, and inclusion champion for the Alphabet companies. I'm grateful for the opportunity today to talk with you about a topic that is really important, not just for how we work together, but for the way we actually think about the work that we do every day. That topic is implicit bias. In this brief session, I plan to walk you through what implicit bias is, why it's relevant in the broader context of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and what we can do to mitigate it. And I hope that by the end of this session, you'll walk away with greater curiosity and greater commitment to furthering yourself on your bias mitigation journey. Let's dive in. So, what is implicit bias? Well, simply put, implicit bias is when our brains make quick judgments and decisions based or beyond our conscious awareness. And to help illustrate this, I'd like you to come with me to this scene. Now, some of you may recognize this as Times Square in New York City. And for those of you who haven't visited Times Square before, you can see from this scene, much like this scene, that it's characterized by things like bright, flashing lights, billboards, music blasting, people everywhere, total sensory overload. Well, I thought that this would be a pretty good analogy for thinking about how our brains process information. Now, for starters, in every moment, we receive 11 million bits of information. Yet, we can only consciously process just 40 bits. So, what that means is that 99.999996% of the information that we process is beyond our conscious awareness. So, in other words, when we are presented with a lot of information, much like the visuals of Times Square, our brains start to take shortcuts to help us parse quickly through the data and make decisions quickly. And we end up relying pretty heavily on pre existing beliefs and learned associations to help those quick decisions. Our brains also take shortcuts when we don't have enough information, right? Our brains try to fill in the gaps. So, for example, let's take a look at the screen. On this image, we have a white background and some black dots, dots that are of irregular sizes, and I can provide you the context that these dots have some relation to each other. What do you think you see? Well, if you haven't figured this out right away, I'm going to add one more piece of context, and that's motion. So now, what do you see? Some of you might have been able to guess right away that this is a dog, a Dalmatian to be specific. And in order to come to that decision, you likely had a few factors at play. First, you had basic observations. You saw the white screen with the black dots on it. And then you had some additional bits of context. One, that the dots related to each other in some way, and then I added the context of motion. But then the space between those pieces of information to the decision you ultimately made probably was filled with schemas and other learned associations that led you to the conclusion that this was a Dalmatian. Those associations could have been things like having seen a Dalmatian before. Maybe you know someone that actually owned a Dalmatian. Or maybe you saw the movie 101 Dalmatians and that really stuck with you and that led you to associate with this right away. But regardless of how you got there, this just highlights that implicit bias lives within the gaps in our understanding, and our brains quickly seek to fill it. So, our ability to make quick decisions saves time, and it also can make the difference between a matter of life or death. So, it has and can serve us well in many cases. However, our implicit biases can sometimes take on a different significance when applied to people. So, to help highlight this, I've got one more example for you. Imagine that it's your morning commute to work and you've just stepped onto a train car that looks much like this. The train is pretty full, but you do a quick scan and you notice that there are 3 empty seats. And each of these seats happen to be about equidistant from where you're standing. Next to each of these seats, there is an elderly person, a person wearing business casual, and a person with multicolored hair and facial piercings. So, quick decision. Which seat would you quickly claim and why? Now, as you think about your decision, what if I gave you some additional context? What if I told you what race each of these people were? Or gender, sexual orientation, educational background, socioeconomic status? What if one of these people vaguely resembled somebody that you know? How might these additional pieces of context influence your decision making? And what associations do you think might be triggered when you encounter these bits of information? Well, ultimately, there's no right answer here. But this example serves to highlight that in a single moment, you can make a decision about these people without fully realizing what implicit associations are coming into play when you make the decision. But when it comes to people, even the tiniest bit of bias can have really big consequences. Think about this, beyond the people in the train car. Consider how this might show up in the way that you evaluate team members that you meet for the first time, or the way you think about your user groups for your research and testing, or your customer segments for the clients that you serve. The particular type of bias that we're talking about related to people is called stereotype bias, when perceptions are skewed based on non objective observations about a person or group of people. And stereotype bias doesn't necessarily work alone. It often works in concert with other types of decision making bias that can ultimately impact people. Now, a quick Google search will yield lists and lists of all the different types of bias that are out there. And I'd encourage you to take some time to do that research. But for the purposes of our discussion today, I'd like to cover 6 types of bias that that you might encounter in your day to day. And as I talk about each, I'd like you to consider, when might you have you encountered this type of bias? What was the context? And what were the outcomes of that bias coming into play? So, first up is accessibility bias. And this one is simply the acknowledgement that we may have a lot of information in our brains, but when we're ready to make a quick decision, we access a subset of it, like sort of like the low hanging fruit, in order to make the decision. And we don't necessarily seek out other information or information that we don't already know. Similar to this is availability bias, otherwise known as recency bias. And in the spirit of low hanging fruit, it's the data in your mind that you're able to access because you've acquired it most recently. So when you think about the ways accessibility and availability bias can come into play, we see this sometimes with performance assessments, especially on the recency bias side, when you think about all of the body of work that someone could complete in a given time period. Yet, when their performance is being evaluated, the accomplishments that happened more recently end up getting weighed and considered more heavily. Another instance of this may be conducting user research with users that are just most available versus thoughtfully curating the representation that you feel that you need for your user groups in order to do your testing. Third type of bias is confirmation bias. And this is one that we see a lot, especially these days, be it on the internet, news channels, or political elections. And it's when we seek out or gravitate toward information that already confirms the things that we believe to be true. So sometimes this can play out in really only seeking feedback from those that you think are going to agree with you instead of engaging with the stakeholders that you think are going to slow down your decision making process because they tend to bring different perspectives. And really consider how often that happens in our day to day. Next up is anchor bias. And this is one where you have some comparison value in your mind against which you compare others. So this can come up, again, with the performance evaluation process, with thinking about how ratings are assigned. Think about how often we look at the ratings from the previous cycle to determine what rating a person should receive in the current cycle, instead of just looking at their body of work for that current cycle and determining the rating independently. Another example is with hiring and thinking about who you're going to fill a role with by considering the outgoing person for that role instead of using structured criteria to evaluate your candidates. Next up, we have overconfidence bias. And this is one that can be really common in work environments where the work is highly specialized, people are highly educated, and in general, it's culturally reinforced that you should appear knowledgeable at all times about the decisions that you make. And so this bias could lead us to lean away from engaging with cross-functional stakeholders who might challenge our beliefs, or it might lead us to not take action upon constructive feedback that we receive because maybe only one person has said it and you have certain beliefs about the person that delivered the feedback. And finally, I'd like to cover affinity bias, also known as like me bias. And it's one where we gravitate toward people that are like us. And it's very natural to do, but imagine how often this plays out in hiring, in forming teams, in allocating work, in deciding who gets promoted. Now, while there are people that clearly benefit from this type of bias, it is one that also can serve to create the in group out group dynamic and also consider who ends up getting excluded as a result of this type of bias. So, overall, I know I ran through these bias types very quickly, but an important part of the journey toward mitigating your biases is to be able to name them. Because once you're able to name them, then you're able to actually notice them in the moment when they're happening. And that increases the chances that you'll be able to squash that bias, check it, do something different in order to eliminate that bias in real time. And all of these types of bias serve to limit the way that, or the perspective that we have when we're making decisions about people. Now, limiting beliefs like these and these limiting perspectives and assumptions often show up in some of the well intentioned and seemingly innocuous comments that we sometimes hear around the workplace as it relates to diversity, equity, and inclusion. I'm going to put some statements up and think about the degree to which these sound familiar to you. We're a meritocracy here. Bias doesn't exist. I don't see color. I treat everyone the same. What's so wrong with, focusing on the majority if the data supports it? And if so much of my bias is subconscious, I can't do anything about that. Have you ever thought any of these things yourself, or have you heard them said around your workplace? Well, the common thread across all of these is that each of these mindsets provide a limited worldview, they lack nuance, and they actually can ultimately be pretty harmful in orgs and for people who consider themselves to be diversity, equity, and inclusion conscious. So consider how stereotype bias and other types of implicit bias might be showing up in each of these. Now, for the purposes of today's discussion, since I don't have much time, I'm going to do a little bit to unpack each of these mindsets, but I'd like to propose to you a way that you can reframe each of these ways of thinking so that you can transition to discussions that are more conscious and nuanced, ones that will actually advance DE&I initiatives. So, in terms of meritocracy, it's important to note that oftentimes when people talk about this, they talk about it as if we've already arrived, as if it's already been achieved, versus talking about it as an aspirational goal. And in this case, the thing that often detracts from meritocracy actually being achieved relates to our understanding of how privilege, hierarchy, power differentials, and the systemic disenfranchisement of underrepresented groups can contribute to the creation and sustainment of inequity. So I would invite you to take on a mindset of exploration when it comes to meritocracy. Really consider and take interest in understanding how dynamics like these can serve to reinforce inequity, because then you can do the work to change your systems, your policies, and your processes to ones that ultimately can bring your organization closer to meritocratic aspirations. Next up is the color blindness way of thinking. Now, I wish it were easy to just say, I don't see color and therefore it doesn't matter, it doesn't exist, because that's what's implicit in this sort of statement. But discussions around saying you don't see color ends up lacking the nuance of understanding the actual differences in the lived experiences of those who are in underrepresented groups. So for this one, I invite you to take on a mindset of empathy. Seek to understand, acknowledge, and respect the differences between yourself and others to drive more empathy and enable you to create space for others to thrive. Next up is the majority rules mentality. Now, the thing about this one is if you only focus and attend to the needs of the majority, then the needs of those who are underrepresented in an organization will continually be left to the side. And it's going to be really important that you treat the stories and the experiences of those who are on the fringes or who are marginalized as just as valid as those who are of the majority. It's not only the right thing to do, but it also is just good business. Because ultimately, there's an inherent scarcity mentality that if we pay more attention to those in majority, then or in the underrepresented groups, then we're taking something away from those that are in the majority. But I invite you in this case to take on a mindset that is more abundant. If you care about diversity, equity, and inclusion, then the stories of those that are underrepresented should be heard and elevated. Even further, it is already a known phenomenon that by attending to the experiences of those that are marginalized and catering more to them, you actually might uncover insights that are beneficial for the whole. There is an effect that is called the curb cut effect that I would encourage you to read up a little bit more about. But this is an exact example of what I just described. Those cuts in the curb on the sidewalk that you notice and that are very commonplace, those originally came about as an accommodation to those who are wheelchair bound to enable them to cross the street. Now, once those curb cuts were put into effect, it was regarded as beneficial for a broader audience. People who are pushing strollers or shopping carts, people who are walking with canes or differently abled in other ways. So ultimately, thinking about those that are on the fringes is going to be important and a game changer because ultimately everyone can benefit from that. And by the way, closed captioning is another example of the curb cut effect as well. And finally, when we talk about the fact that much of our way of being is subconscious in terms of the way we process information, so what can we do about it? Well, I'd invite you to take on a more agentic mindset. And fortunately for you, in the remainder of this session, I'm going to run through some quick tactics and tips that you can consider in order to interrupt your biases and drive greater self awareness and thoughtful intervention on this topic so that you can really make a difference. But before we transition, I wanted to close with this last thought. Mindset matters. So, as long as thoughts like the ones I just stated and just reviewed proliferate in your organization, or if you continue to allow these beliefs to justify your actions or excuse your inaction, then progress toward greater equity, diversity, and inclusion will be stalled. And implicit biases and limiting beliefs can be like a wrecking ball to your DEI efforts. So just think carefully about your commitment to this work and the ways in which you can, work through your bias mitigation journey to enhance and support and uplift these efforts. So, how can we mitigate implicit biases? Let's get to some strategies and move ourselves along this spectrum from awareness to action. Now, the simplest way I can answer this question of how can we mitigate implicit bias is recognizing that there are two efforts that need to happen in parallel. One is looking inward, which involves heightening your sense of self-awareness so that you can check your own biases in moments when it really, really matters. And then looking outward. It requires you to pay close attention to how you interact with others and with the work that you do. And think about how bias flows through systems, and think holistically about how bias can proliferate so that by identifying these things, you can really start to remove the gaps in information, remove the bias blind spots, and drive greater accountability and action around this topic. Now, to further unpack this duality of looking inward and looking outward, I thought I would summarize some of my key tips around 5 principles. The first one is get comfortable with discomfort. Now, it's really important in bias mitigation work to know your story and own your story, and start to identify ways in which you may actually be more susceptible to relying on your assumptions and quick judgments in really critical moments. And so, the best advice I could give you is to be ready to confront that which makes you uncomfortable and possibly ashamed, embarrassed, etc. Because that's where the learning is. That's where the growth is with this work. So grasp these moments tightly, attend to your emotions, recognize and reckon with them, and really think about how you can overcome these feelings to really make some progress in noticing and taking action against the moments of bias that you may encounter. Next up is be humble and be curious. And this is something that I truly believe in. Humility and curiosity are not only attributes that make for strong leadership, but it also is so important to the bias mitigation journey because humility is recognizing what you don't know. And then curiosity is seeking to understand the things that you don't know. And that's part of bias mitigation, being willing to pause, give yourself space to check in with yourself, become more aware of how you're moving through the world and how your thought processes are formed, and start activating your curiosity about your own thinking and others to further your understanding. But then the curiosity extends to your interactions with other people, where you start to listen, acknowledge, validate the stories that are of people that you work with or that you want to be in relation with, in terms of understanding what their lived experiences are, and practice perspective taking. All of this is an exercise in empathy building. But also, I realized I forgot to mention question the assumptions. Be willing to engage in self inquiry so that, and also with others, so that you can question the assumptions that are being made and really challenge them and figure out where assumptions may need to be put to the side to create more objective decision making. Next up is be resourceful. And this means taking ownership of your own education in this space. Now, we're fortunate to have so many thought leaders and scholars who have written podcasts or who've written books, have spoken on podcasts, have created documentaries, and all kinds of media to educate on the lived experiences of marginalized groups. So seek those out, do the work, treat this like a research project as you would any other work that you would do, but really come from a place of empathy and connection building. Now, I mentioned acting responsibly because I wanted to note that sometimes part of the education means that you may be tempted to go out and engage with people that you know who are from underrepresented groups and asking them about their experiences. Now, there may be some who are more than happy to share about their experiences, but also recognize there are people who just want to show up and do their jobs and exist without being reminded of their past traumas. So tread carefully and be mindful when you start engaging with others. But also think about progress over perfection. That means keep moving in a positive direction with your bias mitigation journey, and recognize that this work is a marathon and not a sprint. So sometimes it may feel like progress isn't being made or that you're not making progress with your bias mitigation effort. But habits are formed through repetition. So the more that you continue to check yourself, educate yourself, engage with each others in useful and inclusive ways, that's going to help you start chipping away at some of the biases that you hold. Next up is aim for positive impact, not just positive intent. Now, as I've said before, even a tiny bit of bias can have big consequences, a ripple effect. And it often happens in this space that people want to rest on the laurels of good intentions and well meaning behavior. But positive intention can still lead to negative impacts on underrepresented groups, and that cannot be excused. So just know that the dream here is to have positive intent and seek to minimize harm. And if you find that you ultimately have unintentionally harmed someone as a result of your well intentioned actions, then it's important to apologize sincerely. And the way that you do that is to first acknowledge your responsibility in creating that harm, commit to repairing the solution, but then, very importantly, reflect on what you'll do differently to prevent it from happening again. And last, I'd encourage you to be opportunistic. Now, regardless of what your role or your level is in your organization, there is some sort of opportunity for you to mitigate bias, not only for yourself, but for the work that you do. One place to start is with your team dynamic and thinking about ways to improve psychological safety within your organization and create environments where people feel comfortable to share different perspectives. And ultimately, that leads to greater innovation. And that's something that's pretty well documented. But another way to think about this is actually interrogating your systems, your policies, your processes, the way work gets done. Think about what assumptions might be made about the people that you team with or who contributes to your products. Well, who are the voices in the room? Think about how bias might be showing up in the way that you design, build, research, test. Or if you're a manager, leader, or in some other position of influence, figure out who's in your inner circle. Who are the people that are most influential in the decision making process? And what role can you play to create space for everyone to contribute, even those whose opinions may be underrepresented or in the minority in the room? So, another aspect that is important here is around connection, practicing allyship, advocacy, and building community. And this is something that's really important for getting proximate to people who have different perspectives so that you can figure out how to be more inclusive. So, think about the community that you can build in the position that you're in. Think about the opportunities overall that are before you. There is so much to be done, and we need everybody to be mobilized to think about this. So, in conclusion, as you come to understand the way your biases may be affecting others or the way that you work, hopefully these 5 principles will help you set yourself on a path to really creating some positive intention, creating more self awareness and awareness of the world around you. And then finally, coming to a place of tangible action because awareness can only be scaffolded by action. So ultimately, I'm confident that every single one of you have have the potential to do a lot of great work in this space. All of you can be agents of change, but remember that the change starts with you. So ultimately, let's consider as much as possible the broader impacts of the things that you do on others, and consider those whose voices are could seek to be elevated. Think about the ways that decisions can be done differently and offer yourself as a space for listening, for understanding, for those who could use that piece of connection. That concludes my talk today. Thank you for listening, and I wish you well on your bias mitigation journey.